Thank you. Well, I just want to say, first of all, it's very exciting being here talking to all of you. This is a really fantastic thing that you're all a part of today and, at the moment. So I'm Charlie Rogers. I am a sustainability consultant from Small World Consulting. It's a small business run by Professor Mike Berners-Lee. You may have heard of him. He's written a few books on climate change, the climate crisis and how we can deal with it, how to address it. He's a professor at Lancaster University and he runs the business that I'm part of. And as a company, we look at small businesses, big businesses, everything in between, and help them look at their carbon footprint, tell them what they can do about that carbon footprint, how to reduce it, and also take a more holistic view, looking at their impact on the climate crisis and how they can take steps to address it. So today I'm going to be talking about a piece of work that Small World did in 2019, which was estimating a baseline carbon footprint for the whole of Cumbria. And I'm going to be focusing on Copeland's emissions today, and specifically resident emissions, but I'll touch on industry and visitor footprints a bit later on. So to start, just so everyone's on the same page, I'm going to be talking a lot about carbon footprints. So it'd be good if we all have the same idea of what they are. It's a very misused term, it's a very overused term. But when I'm talking about carbon footprints, what I'm referring to is the best estimate Small World has come up with, a science-based estimate for the full climate impact of something, whether that be a product or an activity. Almost everything we buy or do has a carbon footprint associated with it. So when we talk about carbon footprints, we're looking at everything it takes for something to be produced or an activity to take place. So for example, if we're looking at food, we're going to look at the emissions on the farm that the food was produced on. We're going to look at the emissions of transporting that food to be processed, the emissions in packaging it, the emissions in taking it to supermarkets, and then getting it to your front door. So it's really a whole process. And as you can imagine, there's a lot involved in that. So it is an estimate, but it is a good estimate and it's the best estimate we can come up with. So I'm going to share my screen now. So the first slide that's going to be coming up is a simplified version, broken down into 4 categories of where residents' carbon footprint emissions come from in Copeland. So let me just share this. Wait a minute for it to come up. Very slow computer as always. Okay, so this is the first slide I've got here. So across the top, we've got the average UK person's greenhouse gas footprint, which is around 12.7 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. You might see this carbon dioxide equivalent pop up a few times. So carbon dioxide equivalent is just shorthand for the amount of carbon dioxide, the overall contribution to global warming an object or an action has, taking into account carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases, such as methane and nitrous oxide. But 12.7 tonnes, the average UK person and individual per year. And Copeland is broadly the same. You'll find broadly the same number in all regions of the UK, really. But this graph is specifically Copeland's breakdown of resident emissions. So I'm going to walk you through it. So we've got 4 segments here. So we've got the first orange segment at the top right. We've got home and accommodation. So this is about a quarter of your footprint. And it's from the houses you stay in, the houses you live in, the houses you might stay in when you're on holiday. Then we've got travel, which is the big blue section down in the bottom right. So that's quite a sizable chunk of the Copeland residents' footprint. We've got food in the green there. 20% of your footprint is food. So that's the food you buy in shops, but also the food that you eat when you're eating out at a restaurant or a pub. And in the top left-hand corner, in the yellow, is everything else. So it's everything else you buy that is not edible and is not cars or houses, in fact. So everything edible that's not cars or houses. So that could be services, it could be furniture, electronic devices, etc. Now, the next slide, I'm going to break that down a little bit further. Don't worry if you can't read the writing, because I will go through everything. But this is the Copeland emissions broken down into much smaller areas. And I'm going to talk you through them. So the first one we've got in the top right is home and accommodation. So you can see there that 6% of that orange section is caused by housing. So this is buying a new house, the emissions associated with the building of new houses as well. It also includes home improvements. So if you're retrofitting your house, maybe putting in a ground source heat pump as a more sort of carbon friendly way of heating your house, or doing a kitchen extension. So that's 6% of home and accommodation there. Now, the other chunk of it is 13% for household fuel, so that's gas mainly, and 6% for household electricity. So you can see how much bigger the use of living in a house is compared to buying a new house or doing it up. So we're a fairly cold country with fairly leaky houses, and Cumbria is no exception. The biggest challenge in decarbonising our homes is through reducing this household fuel and electricity use. At a national level, there's all sorts of things going on to reduce the household electricity, which is good, and that's through having less carbon intensive energy sources coming into our national grid. But clearly, the less we use, the better. The less electricity we can use in our houses, the better. And definitely the less household fuel we can use in our houses, the better. So the challenge of household fuel is to use less gas and to make sure our homes don't leak out energy. So that might include, double glazing your windows, or having better roof insulation or insulation in your walls. And although there is a carbon cost of making those changes to houses and definitely building new ones, if that reduces the carbon footprint of using that house, of heating it, of lighting it, I think you can see by the size of those chunks that is a price worth paying. So other things that we could do, we could find ways of using electricity instead of gas to heat our homes, for example. But that still is using carbon, that still has a carbon cost, and we really do need to focus on reducing electricity use as a whole. So that's not a silver bullet solution there. And there are increasingly more technologically advanced ways of actually generating energy, such as solar panels. You could have a small wind turbine, but again, they have a quite serious economic cost and an outlying cost for you, the person owning that house. And there are also things like ground source heat pumps, which for a tiny bit of energy can generate more energy. But again, it costs quite a lot. So, that's for you, the house owner, to really decide what's best for you. So the next slice of our pie is travel. So it's quite a large chunk of Copeland's carbon footprint as a resident. Travel is 30%. The two biggest components of this travel is vehicle fuel and cars, and also personal flights. So to just cover off the personal flights first, there is no getting around the fact that however you want to put an aeroplane in the sky, it's going to have a huge carbon cost because you have to burn through a lot of fuel. It's about 3.5 tons of carbon to take a long haul flight to Hong Kong and back to the UK, which you can see is quite a significant chunk of the average person's greenhouse gas footprint a year. So in a low carbon future, we're going to need to fly less. There are maybe some solutions of a low carbon way of flying, but those are quite a way off. It doesn't mean not flying at all, but we're going to have to reduce the size of that chunk. So moving on to cars. So the 5% that says cars is due to the manufacturing of cars themselves. So whenever you make anything, it will have a carbon cost, and the manufacturing of cars is no exception. Something of like a quarter of the footprint of driving comes from the manufacture of the car itself. So it's quite a significant portion. It's definitely something to take into account if you're thinking of replacing your car before it's time. So Cumbria residents drive around 20% more than the UK average, which definitely affects the carbon footprint of residents in Copeland and Cumbria as a whole. But that's understandable because of the geography of the area, lots of people in rural places, which adds more challenges than telling people to drive less in cities and more well-connected areas. But ways of reducing this impact of cars, vehicle fuel, the manufacturing of cars, drive less, drive more carefully where that's possible. And another option would be to electrify cars. Now, electric cars are often portrayed to us as being a sort of silver bullet out of the problem of the high carbon impact of our transport. And we do need to electrify. If there are going to be cars in our future, they need to be electric. They need to not burn fossil fuels, and they need to not pollute so much. But that electricity still has to come from somewhere. And we do need to reduce our overall electricity usage. So if every person in the UK who had a car swapped their car for an electric car, that would still have a massive carbon footprint. In fact, the manufacture of electric cars is very, very similar, has a very, very similar carbon footprint to the manufacture of normal cars. In fact, exactly the same. And that is still something to consider. So we do need to drive less. There are co-benefits to driving less. In the UK, it's estimated 40,000 people a year die as a result of air pollution. Petrol cars, diesel cars are specifically, especially bad for producing harmful pollutants, especially in built-up areas. Most of this air pollution does come from driving cars. And encouraging people to other forms of transport has cost benefits as well. So, more cycling, even using electric bikes, walking, etc. But this is a challenge of the way we build our communities and structure our communities. We need more public transport. Copeland and Cumbria in general has quite a low public transport use compared to the national average, which is a huge problem. Public transport is an amazing way to travel in a low carbon way. But there are obviously big problems with accessibility, connectivity of public transport in Cumbria as a whole and in Copeland as well. The more public transport, the better. It's much more efficient than individual cars. And moving away from cars will make Copeland a better place to live. Cleaner air in our towns, streets can be pedestrianised, increasing a community feel. There are many, many co-benefits to moving away from a car-dominated transport system. And that's definitely something that Cumbria needs to think of, not only for its residents, but for the way that visitors arrive in Cumbria and the National Park as well. So moving away from travel, we're going to go on to food now, the green segment in the bottom left-hand corner. And food makes up a really quite a large proportion of everyone's footprint in the UK, especially food and drinks in shops. We need to eat. It's going to be a big portion of what we spend our money on. But there are ways to reduce the footprint of the food that you buy. So where does emissions from food come from? Where do emissions from food come from? Well, it's mainly emissions on the farm, and this varies quite dramatically based on what food group you're talking about. So some of the foods with the highest impact are meat and dairy products, especially ruminants like cows and sheep. Cows and sheep burp out lots of methane, which can almost double their carbon footprint compared to other animals. All meat and dairy has a high footprint for the nutrition it contains, and that's something really key. When we're when we feed our animals, if they're not eating pasture, if we're feeding them actual animal feed that's made from human edible crops, you're putting a lot of energy, a lot of resources, and a lot of calories into a food that doesn't have the nutritional benefits to show from that. It's a lot of resources for something of not that high a nutritional value. But I think it's important to say, Mike in his books, he openly says we don't need everyone to become vegan, we don't need everyone to become vegetarian. We just need to think carefully about where our meat's from and how much we eat, and we do need to eat less of it. But this isn't us saying you can't eat anything at all, but we really need to think carefully about where our meat and dairy is from and how much we eat of it. So transport is usually...
Charlie, I just want to say there's about 4 minutes left.
Brilliant, cool, thank you. So transport is not usually a big footprint, part of the carbon footprint of food. The real exception for this is if you buy fruit and vegetable out of season, and if they are shipped on aeroplanes. So fruit and veg out of season in the UK is fine if it's robust, like apples and bananas and melons, because they can be shipped in via boat, which actually has a relatively low carbon cost. The real problem is if you're air freighting food in. That is, even if you're, for example, a pack of asparagus from Peru out of season, air freighted in, you might as well be eating a whole steak. It is that carbon intensive. It has that big a carbon footprint. So, things that we can do about our food, there are 3 main things that Mike highlights. Number 1, reduce meat and dairy. So there's really clear science supporting this, and there are other co-benefits too. So feeding a global population, the whole world could not exist on meat. There is just not enough land to farm that much meat on. And also protecting biodiversity. And it doesn't have to be reduced to 0, we just need to make a dent. The second action is to reduce food waste. Now, food waste is a big problem, especially in the West, and in the UK is no exception. We waste a huge amount of the food we buy in the UK. On average, just over a quarter of the food we buy goes in the bin. The more food we waste, the more we have to produce, which obviously has a carbon cost. And supermarkets often get a lot of flack for this, but actually, consumers have a large part to play in it as well. And also the hospitality industry, so pubs, hotels, restaurants. The third action is to eat seasonally, and this is a really key one. There's no point being vegan or vegetarian if you air freight all of your fruit and vegetables in, because that is incredibly carbon intensive, as carbon intensive as eating meat sometimes. So if you follow these rules, you could cut your individual food footprint by over 50%. So those 3 rules, it's as simple as that. In Cumbria, we have a large visitor industry. So I think it's really important to, look at the hospitality industry in Copeland and see what they're doing about the way they sell and make their food. And also a really important farming economy. Again, we don't need to cut out meat completely. We need to be doing it in the right way and getting it from the right places. And the last segment of this pie I'm going to talk about is everything else. So this is our non-food shopping. You can see that there. It's about 8%. Other non-food shopping, so that's furniture, can be IT. That's quite a significant portion of our footprint. Some of the other things are slightly less in our control. So for example, health, education, other public services. That's the taxes that we pay to fund our schools, to fund our local councils, for example. We have not very much control over that 10% there. But the other non-food shopping, that 8%, we do have control over. So how do we reduce that? Well, we start buying less, for one. We try and buy less. We repair more rather than throwing things away. We need to move away from fast fashion, and we need to buy quality items that last. So an increase in repairing the items that we own has many co-benefits, as well as reducing the carbon footprint. It can stimulate the local economy. If you've got repair shops on your high street, that's suddenly a whole new job area that opens up.
Sorry, Charlie, could I just ask you to make your last couple of points? Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
That last segment, circular economy is the main thing. We need to produce less and we need to look after what we've got. And just to close off, visitor footprint is really important in Copeland, but I would say the main visitor footprint impact coming into Copeland is transport. So it's back to how do we get people to move around in Cumbria? How do we get people to Cumbria in a low carbon way? And yeah, that's me done.
So thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to you this evening. And as Charlie says, I think you're doing a really important thing for democracy in your area. So thank you for listening to us this evening. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority and specifically a couple of businesses in your area. So we operate decommissioned nuclear sites around the country. So you can see from Caithness in Scotland right down to Dungeness in the southeast of England. But moving in more locally here, some of our biggest and most important sites sit in your area. So we have Sellafield Limited, many of you will know. We have the NDA itself, its head office just in West Lakes. We have Energis, which is just on the border of Allerdale and Copeland, which provides education and training for new workers of the future. We've got a big transport business up at Carlisle, freight transport, and another down shipping in Barrow. And further down the coast, but still in your area, is the low-level waste repository, which is near the village of Drigg. So that's what we have in your patch. It's probably the most important area in the UK from a nuclear perspective. Charlie did a fantastic job of explaining how we divide up different parts of a carbon footprint. And we've been working on this in the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority to look at the carbon footprint of those industries that we have, our industries, Sellafield Limited that we own and the low level waste repository that we own. We call these 3 scopes. So Charlie mentioned when we're talking about carbon, we use this terminology of carbon dioxide equivalent, which, as she explained, is all of those greenhouse gases calculated. And for shorthand, we call it carbon. In industry, we use these scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And it's very similar to the way Charlie explained your own personal footprint. So scope 1 for industry is, for instance, the gas that we might burn at Sellafield. Or the fuel in the vehicles that we use at Sellafield. So the direct emissions from that Sellafield site or the low-level waste repository. Scope 2 is the footprint of the electricity that's generated elsewhere that we pull into site and use inside. So that's what we call scope 2. Scope 1's our own emissions. Scope 2, the emissions, the carbon footprint, if you like, of the electricity that we buy. And then scope 3 is kind of the everything else that Charlie talked about. So it's all of the things that we buy to make Sellafield or the low-level waste repository work. So that might be bringing in cement or aggregate to build new buildings. It might be other types of goods and services. It might be the transportation costs of bringing those materials in to our facilities. So that's what we call scope 3. So and there is some more information down here if people want to follow up on that. So what's our footprint and how does it compare with the rest of Cumbria? So Mike's report that Charlie was talking through estimated the whole carbon footprint of Cumbria at about 12 million tonnes. So Charlie talked to you about the 12.7 tonnes for each of us per head. And overall, when you add all of that up in Mike's report for Cumbria, it works out to just about 12,500 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's that's a big footprint. That's all of the visitors that come into Cumbria and what their footprint is. It's all our own footprint and the footprint of the agriculture and in the industry. So the NDA part of that, overall, we're about 1 million tonnes. So we're quite a big portion of Cumbria's footprint. And of course, being a lot of that being located in Copeland makes Copeland, really significant from our perspective. So I mentioned those 3 different scopes.
Couple of minutes left, Steve.
Yeah, super. I've only got a couple more slides. We've mentioned those 3 scopes. So the emissions from our sites directly and the electricity, that's about 1/3 of our overall emissions. And 2/3 is all of the stuff that we buy, that we procure. And you can see up here the different sizes. So the vast majority of our overall footprint in the whole of the NDA is our business at Sellafield, about 750,000 tonnes when you add all of those 3 different scopes together. Down the coast, from Sellafield, the low-level waste repository, about 26,000 tonnes, and the NDA itself, the organisation, is about 10,000 tonnes. So what we've been doing over the last year or two, we've been looking at all of the ways we can reduce that impact, and we've come up with nearly 100 different opportunities. So one of the big ones at Sellafield, we burn a lot of gas at Sellafield to provide combined heat, steam, and also electricity for the site. And we're looking at, over the next 5 to 10 years, how we can change from burning gas and turn that into a more renewable energy supply source. So that's a massive change for us. And also looking at how we procure all of the things from the supply chain that we use. So we've pulled all of that together. We've prioritized them, as you can see here, and the size of the prize. The bigger the bubble, the bigger the more important it is, and how long it's going to take us to implement these things. So we've done all of that. And finally, my last slide. This is a simplified approach to what we're going to be doing in the NDA and at Sellafield and the low-level waste repository. So at the moment, we're working on putting all of that thinking into detailed action plans. You can see here we've got plans to work on buying stuff in a better way from our supply chain and asking them to reduce their footprint, moving to energy efficient lighting across the board, looking at how we operate our ventilation systems. These are nuclear security systems and safety systems. And then looking here at how we move towards renewable energy and looking at how we build things in a low carbon way. And so we have a pathway which takes us to 2050. So we're aiming to be net zero by 2050. That will involve us using some technology to offset a small residual footprint that we can't get rid of, because we can't just turn Sellafield off or the low-level waste repository. It's got about 100 years left to run. So so that was everything I wanted to talk about, Jenny. So happy to hand back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Steve and Charlie, for that.